No.
Why do you want to sit on this?
Your mom. We're on camera now. Okay. Hey guys, this is Dr. Baker here, and this is my mom. Isn't she beautiful? I'm at my mom's house, and it's in the kind of a rural part of Alabama, near a lake. It's a very nice property, and you can see that my mom is a very beautiful woman. She's my favorite mother. No, but my mom has had a tremendous impact on my life. So I'm very grateful to God that He gave me such a wonderful mother. And I wanted you guys to meet her. I'm going to do my do this lecture from my mom's home. I'm going to give you two different shots. I'm going to turn it around, and I'll be sitting in front of the fireplace. And then I'm probably going to go in the back office for the last half. So, but anyway, Mom, say hi. Give them your nice Southern accent.
Hello.
What's your name?
Carolyn
Jones. All right. So I know you probably think it's funny and enjoy. You guys enjoyed meeting my mom. Just wanted to share a little bit with you. I'm here at her home. So I got this wonderful fireplace. All these rocks that built the fireplace came off the property. It's kind of cool. Listen, I'm going to have to fly with these notes today. I got a lot to cover. It's the 4th century. Hopefully some of you guys already read it and read some of the stuff that I asked you to read in advance. So this is the 4th century conflicts with the empire and conflicts within the church. So Diocletian puts together the tetrarchy together after some turnover among leaders in the beginning of towards the end of the 3rd century. And in the beginning of the 4th century, Galerius, there's some turnover, different ones leave and go. And Galerius becomes the Caesar in the East under Diocletian. Galerius was especially unhappy with the Christians and was consistently urging Diocletian for more severe treatment of them because they didn't participate in the worship of the gods and in loyalty to the empire. Do you remember Lactantius? He had been brought into the court of Diocletian to properly train Constantine and the other princes to read Latin and Greek and learn rhetoric. Well, in 299, we learned from Lactantius that Diocletian and Galerius were attending a ceremony where the entrails of an animal were to reveal the future. I don't know if Diocletian wanted to go into war, or maybe he just wanted to know how's the economic outlook. But as the priests were laying out the entrails, some of the Christians in the court of Diocletian began to make the sign of the cross, either on their chest or on their head. We're not told which, but they wanted to protect themselves from the evil spirits. And the fortune tellers complained that was keeping the spirits from allowing them to see the future. And that angered Diocletian, and he already had Galerius pushing him against the Christians. And so he demanded that these Christians be taken away and whipped, flogged for what they did. He also sent orders to his commanders that all Christians serving in the military be made to offer sacrifices to the greatness of the emperor and to the gods. And if they didn't do it, then they were to be taken and dismissed from service. That's from Lactantius of the manner in which the persecutors died. Diocletian then issued an edict. All church buildings were to be taken away by the government or destroyed. And so that happened empire-wide. Not as much in the West, but in the East, it was pretty serious. All Christians must show loyalty to the worship of the gods and to Rome, or they will be punished. Then in 303, in February 303 AD, Diocletian ordered the destruction of the large church in Nicea. That's where his palace was, outside of Rome. The church was visible from the balcony of the emperor's palace. Diocletian and his junior senior Galerius, his junior Caesar Galerius, were watching from the balcony. This was the beginning of Rome escalating their persecution against the Christians. It was more universal in the East than in the West. In the West, Maximian did his share, but Constantius, the father of Constantine, refused to do more than destroy a few church buildings. He wasn't going to persecute the Christians. He never did. But he did do some other things like destroy a couple of churches, In 305, Diocletian stepped down to retire, and Galerius became the Augustus of the East. Galerius passed over Constantine and chose Maximin to be his Caesar. Now, some interesting things were happening. Galerius was sending Constantine into really high-risk battles, yet Constantine was winning. Historians believe that Galerius was trying to have him killed. He was probably afraid that Constantine would join forces with his father and take over the whole empire. Now, in a way, that's exactly what happened, but that's not what was happening at the time. But he was afraid of that. So Galerius intensified his tortures on Christians and looked for a way to get rid of Constantine. Yet Constantine continued to win victories. At a certain point, his father Constantius sent a request to Galerius. I know all these names get kind of confused, but he asked Galerius to send Constantine, his son, to the east part of the empire. I don't know if he says this to Galerius, but he's not doing well. Constantius is physically ailing, and he's afraid that he's going to die soon, and he wants his son to be there with him. They hadn't seen each other for quite a while, maybe 15 years. Galerius refused, and Constantius sent him a second request. In an evening of heavy drinking, Galerius told Constantine, apologies, I just touched something wrong. In an evening of heavy drinking, Galerius told Constantine that he would indeed allow him to go west and be with his father, and he issued him travel orders with a sealed, stamped, writ of travel so Constantine could move anywhere in the empire without, I don't know why he would get in trouble, but he might. Anyway, he was to leave the next morning. Constantine very quickly left the party and packed his bags and made his exit. He got on his horse in the late night hours, and he traveled at a blistering pace. He stopped at every stable, every outpost that had stabling, and he would know that as a commander of forces. If he would stop at an outpost, ask if they had horses, and if they did, he would leave the one he just rode, get on a fresh horse, and take off. So he made his way across the empire at a very quick pace. He arrived in Brittany. That's where his father was. His father was trying to hold off the Picts, from what would become Scotland, from coming down into Brittany. He was trying to hold them off, and so we're pretty sure that Constantine probably led some troops with his father, and they secured the northern border. Now, the conversion of Constantine. I went over the conversion of Constantine in our 5-minute overview, so I'm not going to do it right now in this section. So if you want to review that, you can go on my website and review it, or you can read it in my lecture notes. Suffice it to say, Constantine was motivated to take over the empire when his father dies. He's motivated because his father ends up dying, and his father's troops declare him the emperor. And he is motivated because he doesn't like the persecution against Christians. He never did. His father never did. And that's a little bit of a sign that possibly something was going on with his mother, Helena. Maybe she was a Christian or had Christian influence, and that rubbed off on her first husband, Constantius. Now, remember the issue of second repentance? Well, the great persecution, that's what we're looking at. I didn't say that. When Diocletian declares that all Christians must offer sacrifice and that all soldiers must be kicked out if they don't do it, and that church buildings should be destroyed or confiscated, that was the beginning of the great persecution. The great persecution brings back the issue of second repentance. It's Part of why it's so important in the 2nd century, because it doesn't go away. It has an impact on the 4th century, and you're about to see that. In Carthage, North Africa, a dispute arose around the newly appointed bishop named Caecilian. The claim was made against Caecilian that he had been consecrated or anointed by a bishop who had been a traitor, a trattatore, who had given up, either sprinkled on the altar or had given up writings, sacred scripture to the Romans. And, any of that would cause you to be unfaithful, or would mean that you were unfaithful. Now, there was more involved in this situation, but I can't cover details. The group who opposed Caecilian was led by a man named Donatus. Donatus had already been traveling around the region of Numidia in North Africa, rebaptizing priests who had failed during persecution, and he was commissioning them to preach and administer the Eucharist again. Now, if you remember, in previous times of persecution, it had been determined that it wasn't that you should not rebaptize anyone. They didn't believe in that. Believe. Once you're baptized, that's it. You've been baptized. It doesn't matter if it's a heterodox group. If they baptized you in any way in the name of Jesus, then you're good. But he's doing this not because of the baptism issue, but to secure followers, men, pastors, and deacons in small churches who would look to him as their leader. And that was the issue. Donatus was moving around in a region, and he was taking over small c Catholic churches. And he was proclaiming himself the bishop. Caused a great stir. Now, a little bit of a note on North Africa. The population in North Africa, it seems to me and other historians, were a lot less friendly to Rome than a lot of the other regions. And, we're talking about Carthage, Numidia, and Libya. And I looked it up in Britannica just out of curiosity. And here's what it says in Britannica. North African Christianity always included a vigorous and fanatical element. Some of the animus, now this is me, that's the quote, okay, end of quote. I'm going to argue that some of the animus towards Rome may have been latent hostility for the destruction that Northern Africa endured during the Punic Wars. I mean, it was 400 years prior, or 200 years, I don't remember the date. But, as a Southerner in the United States, I can tell you that there's a lot of animus towards Northerners if they come and try to tell you what to do, because I grew up hearing stories of people, Union soldiers burning houses down and stealing anything of value and killing some people, man. And and even if some of that's not true, it was told to be true. And so I think that Northern Africa was like that. It also appears to be a culture that's rural. Numidia is rural. To the south is the desert. On the coastline, it's very rocky and shallow, and you can't really bring and park big boats, so there weren't any significant ports at all in North Africa. The land, however, is extremely fertile. Numidia provided many, many shiploads of grain for the Roman Empire, so it was a very important region. All of this seems to me to say that it's a rural landscape, and they value their freedom, and they have an intense culture, and they just want to be left alone. They don't want the government coming in and bugging them. They just want to be left alone. That's kind of the way rural people even are to this day, even to this day. Okay. You have my notes, so I'm going fast. Now, the more strident movement of believers, those who followed Donatus, would not accept the sacraments from someone, the sacraments being the elements for what we call the Lord's Supper, what historically in the primitive church was called the Eucharist, which means to celebrate. So the bread and the wine. The people who followed Donatus would not accept the sacraments from someone who was tainted with even a hint of being a traitor during persecution. The bishop in question, Arius, had handed over, this is interesting, had handed over Gnostic writings to the Roman soldiers written in Greek, and they accepted them, and they thought that they were biblical texts, and they burned them. And so in a way, that's kind of smart. But it was still held against him because it looked like he gave in to the Romans, and they didn't like that. So the leading bishop of Numidia called a council and had 70 to 80 African bishops show up from the North African churches, and they basically excommunicated, or they condemned, Donatus. But the controversy wasn't over. Shortly after this local council, Constantine was told about the schism. By this point, he has made his conversion, and he's told about this group of Christians in North Africa that don't want to cooperate, and they're usurping the church's authority. Well, Constantine's new to Christianity, and he's stunned to hear that there's a schism, or that there's division in the Christian church. Little does he know, right? He's a brand new believer. If you believe that, I do. And so he was very naive. He thought that Christians all just held hands and sang Kumbaya. And so he wants these Christians to be at peace. So he goes to two leading bishops of Africa and tells them, look, get this solved. We need unity. We need peace in the church. Well, I brought peace to the empire. Let's have it in the church. And so these two men in Africa looked for help from a bishop in Spain and one in Italy. They got together in another council, and the Christian bishops, Christians didn't believe in suing one another, so bishops held court, basically. And you would present your arguments to the bishops, and whatever they said, that was the law in the Christian world. And so these bishops got together and had like a council. And in that council, they ruled in favor of Constantine. So Constantine figured that the bishops resolved the issue. Well, the Donatist party sent an appeal to Caesar. They wanted an appeal by the emperor. Now that was unprecedented. To ask the Roman emperor to appeal a decision made by Christian bishops. But with an emperor who now claimed to be a Christian, the Donatist party decided to do it. So Constantine reviewed the case. I think he had a meeting with the two men and their legal counsel, and he ruled in favor of Constantine. Well, he thought, because some of that's because he leans towards Rome and bigger cities and not rural Numidia. So if any of the people in Northern Africa had a little bit of animus towards Rome, it was because Rome did that kind of thing. They didn't appreciate rural people. They appreciated people in big cities. I mean, that's kind of what America is like, to be honest with you. So the Donatists appealed to the emperor again, a second time, to judge and decide the controversy. And so Constantine's getting a little bit put out with this. He met one time with Donatus and Constantine, and he was shocked at how stubborn Donatus was and how arrogant he was in the presence of the emperor. He couldn't believe that. And so he was not fond of the Donatists and what they were doing. And so they met again, and again they ruled in favor of Constantine, and again the Donatists appealed. And so by this time, Constantine's put out, and he calls for a larger council to meet in Arles. And that council, in fact, met in 314. And this was the first time that the emperor called for a council. And he went. Now, he didn't do much, but he went to the council and observed what they were doing. He was probably hoping to just put an end to all this nonsense. There were 33 bishops there, 3 of them from Brittany, and they passed various canons and judgments, and again, they condemned Donatus. So we have 3 or 4 judgments against Donatus. But, he continues his actions. And the story has a lot more detail than this, but I don't have time, so I'm flying through it. In the end, Donatus and his churches, now, when I say in the end, there are some things that happened. The emperor had Caecilian and Donatus in Rome under something like a house arrest. He didn't want them going back to North Africa because they stirred up violence and too much trouble. And so he kind of had them in Rome, and he said, you guys just stay here for a while. We're going to see if the situation will calm down if the two of you aren't there. And they escaped. I mean, that's part of the story. It's crazy. They escaped, and both of them went back to North Africa, and things got ginned up again. And Constantine is losing his temper. He's losing his patience with these guys. So anyway, the Donatist movement, just to put an end on the Donatist controversy, the Donatist movement continues into the 5th century. They win converts and they build churches. Now, as a church historian, I would say that those are Christian churches. They're not the small c Catholic church, but they believe in Jesus. And so I would consider them to be that. St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century made the Donatist movement one of his main focal points. He didn't like them and he was against them, and he wrote a lot of homilies, sermons against the Donatists. He urged the state, the emperor, to force the Donatists to join the Catholic Church, which never happened. So now we're to the point of Arius and the Council of Nicea. I'm going to take a moment and I'll be right back. Okay, now we come to Arius and the Council of Nicea. Remember, the title is Conflict with the Empire and Conflict Within the Church. We just did Donatus. Now we're going to do Arius. The story of Arius, like Donatus, begins with Roman persecution. And how do you treat the lapsed believer? Anyway, let me just do it. I'll just read it. So during the Diocletian, and you have my notes anyway. During the Diocletian persecution, bishops in Egypt were divided on how strictly they should deal with lapsed believers. In an Alexandrian prison, this is an interesting story. In a prison in Egypt, Peter, the bishop of Alexandria, and Meletius, a bishop from Upper Egypt, disagreed so sharply about how to deal with lapsed believers during persecution. They found themselves in the same prison cell. Two bishops in the same prison cell. And they disagreed so sharply, they argued so much, that they hung a curtain in the cell so they couldn't see each other. They disassociated themselves from one another. For all we know, they may have excommunicated each other. That was not uncommon in the early church. So Bishop Meletius, who represented the monks from the Egyptian desert, held to a fairly strict protocol. Peter was seen by the Meletian group as lax. He was seen as not disciplined enough. So when the intense persecution ended, these men were released from prison, but their dispute seems to have continued. A well-educated and charismatic man named Arius rose up in the Meletian ranks, the strict group, even being excommunicated by at least two bishop groups or councils who supported Meletius. In a strange turn of events, Peter was arrested again and killed. In the aftermath, Arius began to argue in favor of the Catholic Church. And eventually, he was ordained to be a presbyter. The Meletians considered him to be a traitor because he did that. And they wanted to defeat his influence. So, when we talk about denominations now, well, here you're getting to hear about it. And this is early church, primitive Christianity. Well, maybe we're really about to have early Christianity when they have documents. They got a lot of documents now. So it's no longer primitive. But nonetheless, Arius began to build a reputation as a scholar. Excuse me. We only touched on the controversy about Origen, if you guys remember, in our, I think we did it in our, well, I don't remember when we did it, but the Origenist controversy, you might remember, where we talked about how the idea of universal salvation was presented in his De Principe on first principles. Well, also, the first debates about the Trinity were to some degree based on some comments Origen made, and he used the Greek term homoousias. Well, that's going to come back up. The conflict with Arius brings Origen back into the picture. The conflict is the first major theological struggle over the definition of the Trinity, and is the main reason Constantine called the First Catholic Council of Nicea in 325. After Origen's death, church leaders and thinkers struggled about the concepts of how the Father and the Son fit together, because Origen talks about it in one of his writings. Following the transcendent view of Clement and Origen, transcendence meaning that God is completely separated. God the Father is completely different from us. I mean, his ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts, And that the Son, Jesus, so the Father is utterly transcendent, but God reveals himself through his Son in the incarnation. And so, but Arius got a hold of the transcendence view of the Father, and he went beyond what I believe Clement and Origen had done. And he held that the only begotten being, the only non-created being is the Father. The Son was begotten, and therefore he was created, according to Arius. And so Arius stated, since Jesus was a created being, then there, quote, was a time when he was not. In other words, there was a time when he didn't exist. And that was his undoing. No one wanted to put up with that. We had plenty of evidence now in the biblical text. John chapter 1, Philippians chapter 2, and these men, they didn't know they were chapters, but they knew these writings by this time. The Meletians demanded that Arius be disciplined, and so a council was called. 100 bishops attended, and they condemned Arius to be exiled. Now that's interesting. They wanted him sent away into the desert. By the time we get to the Nicene Council, there's a struggle for power over what was happening in Egypt. And Arianism was a big part of that. The Arians had established their own churches. They had their own leaders. And so we had two separate churches. I don't know. It's a debate. It's theological. Nowadays we're going to say that the Arians were heretics because they didn't believe that Jesus was homoousias, the same substance. As a church historian, I would call you to think about it a little more soberly. This was the beginning of even defining what the Trinity was and truly understanding and getting a very clear picture of the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. So I don't know. I guess I hesitate to not call them Christians, but technically they were labeled heretics. So anyway, so that's the situation that Emperor Constantine found out about it, and it reminded him of Donatus. And he's like, are you kidding me? We have another issue like this? And so like the Donatist issue, the Arian controversy continues into the 5th century. They never deal with it. They never can shut it down. This issue was huge with respect to the development of theology and the Trinity. And we're going to see that that possibly the issue in the second half of the 4th century flows from the struggle with Arius and orthodoxy. We will see that possibly the issue in the second, so I didn't read that very well. You have my notes though. So we get to the Council of Nicea in 325, and this is all designed to get the church on one page with respect to the divinity of Christ. It actually wasn't about the Trinity. It was about the divinity of Christ. And Constantine didn't like the confusion, and he didn't like the division, and he wants to get everybody on one page so we can hold hands and sing Kumbaya. So, do you guys even know what that means? I hope you do. It's kind of an Americanism. I'll explain it maybe after we get done in our live discussion. Anyway, there are a lot of things that are said about the Council of Nicea that are just wrong, said and written. For example, the Council of Nicea was not the beginning of the Catholic Church. It was not the place where Christianity decided that Jesus was divine. Jesus was divine. From the beginning, they believed Jesus was divine. So that's not what happened at Nicea. At Nicea is not when the New Testament canon was official. They didn't even bring up the New Testament's documents and what should be read. And the Nicea was not controlled by Constantine. Yes, he called them together and he did participate, but he didn't control it. Now, there are some places where he flexed his muscle, and he probably shouldn't have done that in my opinion, but he did. But things were not decided by a vote. They didn't vote on the Trinity. They didn't vote on the official biblical text. They didn't vote against the Gnostic Gospels. And Christianity was not voted to be the official religion. All of that stuff happens later in church history, and most of it is not done at a church council. Constantine's role. I want to talk about that real quickly. In 324, the Licinius and Constantine were in a struggle for who would be the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Now, eventually, Constantine would win the battle and be done with it. But at the time of the Council of Nicea, they were in a cold war. They had had a truce. They're going to agree to get along. Well, that doesn't last because Licinius begins to persecute Christians again, or tries to, or says he's going to. And Constantine's like, okay, you know what? None of that. And he attacked some of Constantine's troops, I believe. Anyway, eventually Constantine defeats Licinius, and he becomes the sole ruler of the empire. Almost immediately, Constantine gets reports about bishops and churches in Egypt that were in disarray. And he had been told about the conflict between Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, and Arius, a presbyter. And, Constantine shows right here by calling this council that he took seriously his role as the Pontifex Maximus, the greatest priest in the Roman Empire. And kind of like in the United States, the president by default is the commander of the military. He's the commander-in-chief. In Rome, every single emperor is the Pontifex Maximus. He is responsible for the health and vitality of all religion in the Roman Empire. And so Constantine's a Christian, so he takes it seriously. So as the Pontifex Maximus, he calls these people together and says, all right, now here's the thing. In his rear view mirror, he remembers how he handled Donatus, and he did some things that he shouldn't have. He lost his temper, and he sent him in exile once, and then he recalled him. It's crazy. So he's trying to redo, kind of like not handle it like he did Donatus. So he dispatches Hosius, the bishop from Spain, to try to correct this thing. Constantine had put down all contenders, and he wanted the empire to be in peace. Shortly after bringing the empire into peace, he's confronted with the Donatus crisis. And now he's aware of another crisis, and he's losing patience with this. He's a young Christian, he's an alpha male, he's a warrior, and he's got a bad temper. You could argue that, he wasn't a Christian. I know a lot of Christians that would fit that description, actually, through history. But anyway, Constantine's determined to call a worldwide council and get the church all on the same page. So he sends messengers all around the empire, inviting bishops to come at his expense. I'm going to send you, I don't remember the name of it now, it was the imperial, almost like the imperial postal service. He could send you an imperial wagon and bring you and your contingency, and he'll pay for it. And then he'll pay for all your everything, all your expenses. Just please come and be with us. Initially, it was going to be in Ankara. I think Ankara is, I can't remember exactly where that is. Some of you know, I'm sure. But then he changed his mind because due to weather, and he had a villa, a real nice, spacious mansion of sorts in Nicea. And so he changes it to that. Well, because he did that, only 220 bishops attended. There were more people there than the bishops, so there was probably more than 300 people there because some of the bishops brought, maybe a deacon or a presbyter or something. But only 220 bishops attended, and the reason I say only is because almost all of them were from the east. Only 8 officials came from what we call the west. Rome only sent 2 presbyters. The bishop didn't even come from Rome. We think the Western Church, circling their wagons around Rome, were offended that Constantine didn't have this first historic council closer to Rome. They wanted it to be in the western sector. So they didn't like it, and they refused to come, a lot of them. Just, no, I'm not going. And let me tell you, when we get to the Great Schism, that's one tiny piece of what brings the Great Schism 700 years later. We had the date of Easter. I mean, there's just multiple things that happen, little pieces of grit in your, under your feet slowly build up to where you're rubbing your feet raw. And that leads you to take your shoes off. Well, that's how the schism developed, in my opinion. And Nicea is part of that. Because, and I don't think Constantine had any intentions of leaving anybody out, but the Western bishops were offended. So, you should not be too offended. We shouldn't be so easily offended. But anyway, hopefully you guys read the articles I sent. I tried to give you some outside reading that would really help you, because I knew I needed to hustle with this. I'm going to have to start increasing my speed on all the lectures and covering more ground because of the changes that we've been dealt, okay? Trying to cover all the material. You won't be responsible for a lot of it, but I want to cover it. So Constantine, during the council, sat with his hand, kind of, what they said was he sat on his throne, kind of with his hand on his chin a lot of the times, and his eyes closed. And some of the bishops thought he was falling asleep. But every now and then they would be in discussion about theological matters and biblical matters and all that. And he would pipe up and say something in response to something someone had said. And they realized, okay, not only does he speak Greek, but he understands some of these theological constructs because he made some really good points. And so that was interesting to them. But you got to remember, Constantine had been trained, had been tutored by Lactantius, a true scholar and a Christian, one of the greatest minds of the day. And so Constantine had been well schooled. He wasn't an idiot. Constantine insisted, however, that the term homoousias be used in the creedal formula from that council so that they would have a definitive statement that the whole church, the whole universal church, would abide by. Arius used homoousias, which is part of what pushed the emperor and some of the bishops to call the council in the first place. And you can see in my notes, homoousias means same substance, and a small one letter, the letter I, iota, all of it hung on one letter. Homoousias means similar substance, and it's basically making Jesus less than God the Father. Some have stated that Constantine pushed for this term because he had been influenced by the pro-Origenists, because Origen had used the term in the past, homoousias. Well, and you have to remember that homoousias had been used by Dionysius of Alexandria in his Trinitarian debate against Dionysius of Rome. You guys might remember that. Two men named Dionysius, one speaking Latin, one speaking Greek, and they didn't understand each other and they excommunicated each other or something. And it was also used by Paul Samosata, the term homoousias. However, so it wasn't a new term, but some of the bishops were offended by that word because it doesn't appear in the New Testament, in any of the texts that they had. Now, I doubt any of the bishops had a full New Testament, but they have a lot of writings. They have enough writings that, we're getting closer to the canon, as we would call it, But it wasn't in the scriptures, and so they didn't like it. So here we are. And hopefully you guys read the stuff I put on there. Some great reading about the Nicene Council. And hopefully in our live discussion, we'll talk about it. We'll see. On July 25th, 325, Constantine called for a real festival, a banquet to close the council. He had already given a lot of the bishops monies and buildings prior to Nicea, but now he showed more generosity. He was giving bags of gold to a lot of the bishops that were in the Great Hall. He went around the hall greeting bishops and giving them gifts. Hopefully you read the reading. He went to some of the men who were maimed in the persecution. Like if their hands were gnarled because they cut their fingers, he would kiss their hands. One man had an eye gouged out, and Constantine kissed his empty eye socket. I don't know. That to me speaks of something more than a man who's just wanting political influence. But anyway, and I do believe those stories. Those were actually written after Eusebius, but I just think they're true. I don't know. I think if they weren't true, we would have had writers saying they weren't true. But anyway, he urged all of the bishops to pray for him and to hold firmly to the peace that they had attained at the council. The Emperor Constantine was filled with optimism. A lot of the bishops were not thrilled, and they weren't filled with optimism. For many of them, Constantine was a novice. He wasn't a bishop. He didn't know enough about the Bible, and he was pushing a creed that contained a non-biblical term, homoousias. Even though now all of Christianity believes in that. I don't know. It was also clear that the church was now under a certain amount of governmental control. The emperor reversed some of the excommunication. Some of the bishops who had been excommunicated, Constantine with a word said, no, he's no longer excommunicated, bring him back in, as if he was a bishop, and he wasn't. So, there's some legitimate criticism of Constantine and how he handled the Nicene Council. However, here's the problem. Now an excommunicated bishop could be exiled. And indeed, that's what happens. Constantine sends some bishops who are stubborn and won't listen to anybody around them. He sends them out into the hinterlands. And that's unfortunate. He's the emperor, and he can have a man killed if he wants. But anyway. Mostly, however, bishops were thankful that their time of deadly persecution had come to an end. And many of them had no doubt that Constantine was in fact a believer, a fellow brother of faith now. Just by the way he acted and some of his thoughts, they believed it. The theological issues addressed at Nicea, however, were not over. As Protestants, we tend to act like Nicea was the greatest thing and everybody's on the same page. Well, listen to this. While the Council of Nicea answered some problems, it created a lot more problems than it solved. And for the next at least 100 years and maybe for the next 150 years, we have really bad conflict among men, bishops, and Christians over the Council of Nicea, what we call Nicene Christianity or Nicene doctrine. And we'll hit that next in the next one. Listen, I've been quick. I apologize if I've been too quick, But again, I'm going to try to start covering more material. And, I look forward to hearing your discussion. And I look forward to being with you guys live. And we got to talk more when I get, get back in the class, get back live. We need to talk about what we're going to do with the classroom presentations. I want you guys, I've already sent you the stuff, and I'm hoping you've already tried to figure out, name one or two things. I want two students to present in class the same topic, and maybe compare notes so you're not saying the exact same things. It's not a joint effort, but I want to do a more thorough job of each topic. And so I want two students to talk about the same topic. We'll talk more about that in our live discussion, okay? I hope you guys had a good weekend, or you're having a good weekend. I don't know if you guys watched the lecture in advance. I would hope so, but then you have my lecture notes. And please do the outside reading. And you know what? I'll see you in, about 2.5 hours? Is that right? 2.5 hours. I'll see you guys live, okay? Well, 2.5 hours if you're not watching it in advance. Take care.